Tonight, we're focusing on the review process. This is a review-focused masterclass, so we will be discussing review strategies for all different question types, games, reasoning, and reading comprehension. We've had some fantastic student presentations in recent weeks, and it's been a while, so I thought we could use a refresher on different review strategies for different section types, different question types. I've talked a lot about the Socratic review method in the past. I'll talk about it again, and I'll also change it up with some other strategies I haven't spoken about before. So just for context, I recommend what I call the LASER approach to LSAT prep. LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. And this is the framework underlying my LSAT study plans. But review, the last phase, is often the most neglected, but it's also the most important of those phases. And it really requires that you own the material. So it actually asks more of you than a lot of the other phases of studying do. You can read textbooks, you can watch videos, you can even hire a tutor and simply work through problems, but you've got to put in the work on your end to get the most out of the process. This is passive versus active learning. So not just sitting back and absorbing and watching, really taking ownership of the material and ownership of your own learning process, being deliberate about your prep. If you are just looking to get into the 150s or 160s, you can blindly copy and absorb other folks' techniques. But if you really want a top score, it's going to require that you add something to the process of your own and adapt it to your own situation. Just like LSAT logic games, the curveballs, they throw you for a loop, which means that blindly copying other people's styles isn't going to work. That's really true for the entire process in general with regard to the most difficult problems. I was working with a student last week, and he was working out of an LSAT textbook, just going over whatever happened to be the next page, the next problem in the book, but the exam's just a few weeks away. And I told him, this is the time for you to own the process and focus on your particular weak areas, not do some random logic game from the 1990s, but rather focusing on more recent material and then the material that you specifically need to be working on. And by attending this class live, you've already got the opportunity to take ownership of the process. You're welcome to interrupt me at any point, even right now, to ask questions, to ask for clarification, to add something of your own if you feel it would be useful for yourself and for others to do so. I'm totally fine with it. Of course, I have plenty I can talk about, but I always allow room for your needs, your questions, your comments. And so feel free to type in the chat or just unmute yourself and chime in at any point about your own experience or to ask questions. I'm happy to consider all of it. Now, again, the default approach for studying is what I call the obsessive practice exam narrative, where you simply take exam after exam, section after section, problem after problem. You score yourself, you're happy, you're sad about the results, and you move on. And it's natural to do that with a bunch of the timed sections or timed exams, but it could also be a default approach if you're simply drilling by type. If my study plan tells you drill inference questions, drill strengthening questions, drill weakening questions, you can do that. But you know what? Listen, like if you're good on strengthening questions, you could drill fewer of those and move on to something else. The schedules are just a framework. There really is no one size fits all when it comes to this process. Everyone has their own unique way of thinking about the exam, their own unique areas of strength and weakness. And also, I mean, you may be taking the exam in November, just a few weeks away. You may be then decide to postpone to January. If you postpone to January, that changes everything. Don't stick with your November LSAT study plan if you've added an additional 2 months to the process. That totally changes what you should be working on. Rather than doing the most recent exams now, you probably want to save a lot of those for full-length timed practice in the lead up to January. And with regard to that default approach, that's honestly the same thing I was doing back when I was studying for this exam. It took me a long time to realize that doing fewer problems and reviewing them in more depth was far more effective than just doing exams and looking at the answer key and saying to myself, I get it now, and then moving on to the very next thing. So I want you to, if you take away nothing else from this class tonight, put your review process down somewhere, articulate it put it out into the world. It can't happen only inside your head. So if you want to write down like a mistake journal, a wrong answer journal, keeping a log of some kind is really useful. Or if you've been attending the student study groups on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, that's a fantastic place to talk it out and really devote some time to the process and speak it out to get feedback from others and to clarify your own understanding as well. That's part of why I love doing these student presentations in the group coaching mastermind groups, which we have, by the way, in about 1 hour, one of those, where students have the chance to clarify their own understanding and speak it out to get feedback from me and from others. And I think it's really important that all of you adopt that in some way. That could be in a study group, that could be with a coach or a tutor, it could be in your journal by yourself, but I think it involves getting it out of your own head in some way. And whether that's writing out your own explanations or your review process, or even writing your own LSAT style problems, just to discover how difficult it can be. I'm really impressed with all of you who did that, by the way. That's a fantastic way to create something and see what does it really look like versus just looking at the answer key and thinking about it a little bit and not dwelling on it nearly as long as you need to. I want to give a brief shout out to both Alyssa and Elena for some fantastic presentations in the past couple of weeks, the past month. It was definitely, I hope, eye-opening for a lot of you. I got a lot of great feedback on it. It was really cool for me to see just how far both of you guys took it. And I'm excited to continue having those discussions. I'm going to put those links in the chat for the write-ups that both of you had, as well as the videos from those mastermind calls, because I think it could be useful for everyone who didn't have the chance to look at that to see exactly what that process looked like. Because both Alyssa and Elena, both of you really took ownership of the review process, breaking it down step by step, different drill ideas, I think is really cool. And I think everyone would benefit from implementing those in some way, or at the very least, creating their own review process, their own drilling strategies. And I think it's just, I put those there just so that everyone else can see what exactly that looks like. It's going to look different for every single student. It can be in a Google Doc like both of these are. It could be in an Excel spreadsheet. It could be in a physical Moleskine notebook or a spiral bound or whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. Do whatever works best for you, but take ownership of it, and that's fine. I also want to add, not just to review the problems you get wrong, but also everything you have difficulty with, everything you're not totally 100% sure about, because even if you guess and get it right, it could have just as easily gone the other way the next time around. And so those are very important to review as well. I see Alyssa's clarifying that she also uses a spreadsheet. So very cool to add that into the mix as well. Now, I've got a little something of my own review process I'm putting here related to the Socratic review method. I'm going to put the text summary of that in the chat as well so everyone can see. And basically, it's about, and I'll walk through this more in a moment, but it's again about clarifying where your misunderstanding is coming from, the stimulus, the question stem, or the choices. So breaking it down step by step, each of those parts to see exactly what about the problem may have tripped you up. So really dissecting it line by line, word by word. Now, I've put into I'm going to put this in the chat in just a moment. It's an example of a student written review process. We'll look at it in a second, just to see an example of what this Socratic review method could look like in practice: stimulus, question stem, choices. So what I really like about this one is that it's from a real student, laying out exactly what his thought process was like. He talks about the stimulus and what gave him trouble about it. He then gets into the answer choices and breaks those down as well. He even wrote out by hand how he was diagramming the stimulus. And so he gives us a chronological play-by-play walkthrough of what he was thinking in the moment. He says he was stumped at first, triggered by if-then structure, knowing that we're dealing with conditionality. And he lays out the argument and then the reasoning underlying the argument. And then from there, he goes on to looking at the formal logic and recognizing what's going on there. He points out choice B was a distortion, C was a mischaracterization, D was not logically related, E was tempting. And you can look up the exact problem later if you want. This is from the freely available June 2007 LSAT. And even whether he's right or wrong in his thought process, I'm not nearly as concerned about as the fact that he's making the attempt to break it down systematically. So if we notice that conditionality is what might give you trouble. If you're triggered by the if-then language and you're stumped as a result of it, and it takes you an extra few minutes to break it down and diagram it, and you find it useful or necessary to diagram, that's important to recognize. Maybe you want to change something going forward, or drill conditionality, or drill contrapositives, or drill necessary sufficient confusion. They say the person who wrote this says the author takes a condition that is merely necessary and treats it as sufficient. And that actually is the case for this particular question. So he was right about that. The point being that if conditionality and mistaken reversals or confusing necessary and sufficient gives you trouble, then that's something you've got to work on the side, going back to basics. So when you analyze the stimulus and you see what gives you trouble there, you can learn that maybe your issue is not simply related to question stem type. It may not be about necessary assumption or sufficient assumption or strengthen or weaken. That may not be what gave you trouble about the question. It may not be what led you astray in the question. It could have simply been the stimulus itself. And you can discover that through this process. So when I lay out the Socratic review method in the chat here, what I was doing is I'm leading you down a process where you're actually step by step figuring out, okay, well, is it the stimulus that gave me trouble? Is it the method of reasoning? Is it the underlying gap or flaw in the stimulus? Or was it the question stem? Or was it the answer choices? A lot of folks will drill question stem type and say, oh, I'm bad at flaw questions or I'm bad at necessary assumption questions. And it may simply be that you're getting those wrong because there are a lot of them to get wrong, because they appear more often than other question types. So your issue may not actually be related to flaw or necessary assumption. It could just be you're getting hard questions wrong because they're hard, or you're getting questions involving numbers and percentages wrong a lot, in which case you might want to drill those specifically, or questions involving correlation causation flaws and gaps, or it may be related to just simply things involving necessary and sufficient confusion. There's a variety of different things it could be, or maybe it's formal logic. And so whatever it is, you've got to identify that specifically, and it's really only through that review process that you can discover this. So 3 parts: stimulus, or in the case of reading comprehension, the passage, the question stem, and then the answer choices. So a couple of things to be looking for in logical reasoning in particular. These are things that are aside from, again, question stem type or method of reasoning. Words like unless, except, until, and without, those often give folks trouble. It's beyond simply necessary and sufficient confusion, condition confusion. So you want to look at that. Are you getting trapped by filler or information that's irrelevant to the core of the argument? So on the one hand, you may have things like evidence indicators, conclusion indicators, and you're good at those. You may want to dodge counter premises. You may want to deal with sub-conclusions. And then aside from that, there's simply filler. And so are you good at cutting away the filler to focus on the core of the argument? Are you tripped up by seeing weird arguments that are unlike those you might typically see in everyday life? Things that people don't typically say, but could throw you for a loop. You want to focus on that. Then these are 5 tricks, ways they ramp up the difficulty level of logical reasoning questions. They may shift the degree of certainty. So saying sometimes in the evidence and then the majority of the time in the conclusion, or saying some people in the evidence and most people in the conclusion, talking about the category of things they're discussing. Absolute versus relative relates to numbers and percentages in a lot of cases. So the majority of a group could still be a very small number. If there are 10 people in a class, a majority could be only 6. 6 is not really a large number when compared to the population of the planet Earth or of a country. So it may not be a lot of people, even though it's a large percentage. If you have trouble with the contrapositive, that's another way to ramp up difficulty level. And so requiring you to take the contrapositive in order to better link together 2 conditionals can be tricky, but it's important. And when there are multiple conditional statements, that can even be tougher to navigate, in which case you'd want to focus more on formal logic. So these are all things to look for. And again, they're not about the particular question type that you're dealing with. It's beyond that. Natalie left a great comment in the chat here saying that she wrote, I'm trying to explain to my husband who has no idea what the LSAT is, so that forces me to explain it a few times. That's fantastic. I mean, thinking about how would you explain it to a 7-year-old? How would you explain it to your roommate? Somebody who has no exposure to the LSAT at all, it really forces you to simplify it, to dumb it down. And like I've talked about a lot in the reading comp deep dives we've been doing recently, that can help you as well to simplify, to dumb it down, helps you get through it faster, because then you can rely upon your dumbed down summary of the passage or the stimulus rather than LSAC's articulation of those concepts. So when you're doing that wrong answer journal or mistake journal, could you paraphrase the stimulus? Could you paraphrase the passage? I think a great drill for either would be, I'll talk about in the reading comprehension context. Could you go through a bunch of passages, simply summarizing the main idea, the main point of the passage, and then check it against LSAC's articulation of the main idea in the correct answer to the main idea or primary purpose question? You could go back and do the other questions later, but as a drill, as an exercise to really get down the basics of reading comprehension, if reading comp is what gives you trouble, that could be a useful thing to do. And when you're writing out your summary, that is in a way your review. You could do it specifically for the reading comp passages that tend to give you trouble. And so for a lot of pre-law students with more of a humanities background, that may be science passages. But let's face it, a lot of even the law passages are rather academic in nature. They're really complex. They're really boring. They're very high level. And so there's a lot of room to dumb it down. And we've been doing that in the deep dives. We have another deep dive scheduled for tomorrow night. We'll go into that more there. Talking about the question stem, a lot of folks will gloss over question stem and focus their analysis on the stimulus or on the answer choices, but actually there's quite a bit of room for confusion in question stems as well. I've got a couple of areas in mind where I see this happen a lot. One of them is strengthen versus most strongly supported. You may think of the word support as indicating strengthening, because support is in a way a synonym for strengthen, but they're very different question types. Strengthen questions, like weaken, open the door to new information. So it doesn't matter how extreme it is, as long as it gets the job done. Versus most strongly supported is really a type of inference question where you're asking, based on the stimulus, what else is likely to be true or almost certainly true. So they're not really looking for new information. They're looking for something supported by the stimulus. So strengthen opens the door to new information. Most strongly supported, that's not really what they're looking for, but students often confuse those two. So if you got a question wrong, that's one of those two types. It's worth taking a moment to think to yourself, are you confusing those two types when in reality they're very different? Alyssa, jump in, please. I saw you raised your hand if it's not related.
Yeah, of course. The question stems of what you're mentioning, the most strongly supported versus the strengthening question. I just want to sort this out in my mind because I have been seeing this in a few of the PTs I've been taking. Say, for example, a strengthen question, the stem might say something like, which one of the answer choices below most strongly supports the above? That would be a strengthening question versus a most strongly support question is which one, I think you know what I'm trying to say, but it's using the same language, but one of them is speaking to the answer choices and one of them is speaking to the stimulus.
That's a great point, Alyssa. I'm glad you raised it. And so LSAC, they are very clever at their question stem wording. So you're correct that in some less common cases, they will use the phrase most strongly supported or most strongly supports. It's all context specific. So technically it is possible to have a question stem that uses the phrase most strongly supported, but have it be a strengthening question. Let me think how that might be worded. Let's say, which one of the following, if true, would most strongly support the information above or most strongly support the argument above? If we're supporting the information above, that would be strengthening. But alternatively, if we're saying the information above most strongly supports which one of the following, that would be inference. So if you're supporting what's above in the stimulus, you're strengthening. If it's supported by the above, then it's inference. So thank you for that question. That's a good point of clarification. So I was referring to the most strongly supported question type, which is inference. There are some that phrases that where that language is, that phrase is indicating strengthen, but it's less common. But it's all, the devil's always in the details. It's worth analyzing those and seeing if you're getting a bunch of them wrong, make sure you're properly distinguishing them. In my categorizations, I do separate them by type, strengthen versus inference, so you can check it against the categorizations. Another type that students often confuse, and Natalie, I see you have a question also. Is it related to this?
Yeah.
If so, feel free to jump in.
So for me, how I think about it is when it says like must be true or what is supported by, like I feel them, I feel like they're very similar. In my head, there's always like an arrow, like I put an arrow from the stimulus to the answer choice, because then the answer would be found there, versus like strengthening, it's the other way around, because it goes from the answer choice to the stimulus, my arrow, because then I have to fill in something to make it stronger. So
yeah.
I
mean, drawing an arrow is great if it helps you. I mean, the thing is that, of course, on the flex, there's no way to draw an arrow on the screen.
Just in my head, that every time that it's like must be true or supported by, I always think that the answer must be in this stimulus, versus strengthening or weakening is something in addition that must be brought in the stimulus.
Correct. Yeah. So if you could do it in your head, fantastic. So yes, the idea is that for inference questions, I would think of the arrow as going down. The stimulus is supporting the answer choice. For strengthen and weaken, where you're adding new information, the arrow is going up. So the choices are giving new information or new support to the stimulus in the case of strengthen.
Okay,
yeah, it's a great way to think about it. A lot of folks do the arrow thing. Another big logical reasoning type that students confuse is necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. Very different types. They both often use the word assumption or assumes. They're asking for very different things. I've done a necessary assumption workshop and a sufficient assumption workshop in the logical reasoning portion of the course. And so you can go to either of those lessons where I believe I cover it in both contexts, the difference between them, but it's very important to properly distinguish between the two. Alana, you have a related question to this? So you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just wanting to recap. So it's almost like with the strengthen, the answer choice strengthens the stimulus.
Yes.
And then with the strongly supported, the stimulus supports the answer choice.
Exactly.
But a while back, you said something about what could be really helpful with reading comp. What types of questions were those?
When I was speaking about reading comp a few minutes ago, I was talking about main idea questions or main point questions.
Okay, not inference questions. Okay.
No, I was simply talking about pre-phrasing the main idea of the passage to make sure you've got it down.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course. Two more types that I want to talk about: must be true versus most strongly supported. They're both inference family, but they're asking for different things. Must be true, you're looking for 100% guaranteed by the stimulus. Most strongly supported, you're looking for maybe, I think of it as 90 to 95% supported by the stimulus. So there's a little bit of wiggle room sometimes, meaning that the correct answer to a most strongly supported question is not necessarily 100% guaranteed. So some folks will get most strongly supported wrong because they have too high a standard of proof they're looking for based on the stimulus, when in reality, there is a little bit of wiggle room where it's okay to make a reasonable assumption, whichever choice is best supported by the stimulus. So make sure, again, it's properly understanding the question type there. Lastly, flaw versus weaken. A lot of folks get these two confused or think that it's not okay for a weaken answer to be extreme. Flaw questions ask you to identify or articulate the flaw in the stimulus. Weaken opens the door to new information to harm the argument. So weaken is doing something to the argument. Flaw is simply describing something about the argument. I'm going to put those four types in the chat if anybody wants to look into them more later, if you potentially have trouble distinguishing between any of those two. So I'm bringing this up in the context of what about question stems might confuse you or give you trouble if you're not totally solid on one of the types. It's important to recognize that. Then there's the answer choices. You want to think about what about the wrong answer tempted you and what makes it wrong. What about the right answer was unappealing to you or discouraging, and what ultimately makes it correct. I alluded to this a little bit in those two images I showed. The red images about ways they make logical reasoning more difficult. I'll share a few more here. The wrong answer may be a little bit too extreme in some ways, so going a little bit too far beyond what's supported in terms of degree of certainty or the category of things they're discussing. They may add in irrelevant information that was not contained in the stimulus. It may be the exact polar opposite of the stimulus. And so it feels good because it technically has a lot of the same information, but adding the word not or something similar can totally change the meaning of what's said. Or they may make a minor little tweak to one small part, like an adverb or an adjective. A little bit wrong makes it all wrong. Or they may combine two different parts of the information in the stimulus in ways that don't make sense. So pulling half of sentence one, the first half of sentence one, the second half of sentence two, combining them together, you see both phrases that were in the stimulus, so you feel like it's good, but again, they're combined in a way that's not permitted. Or they may attribute information to the wrong person. So like the editor versus the letter to the editor. Or in reading comprehension, one group of scientists versus the critics of those scientists. You see this a lot in reading comprehension. Kash is asking, does level of certainty matter in flaw questions? Yeah, so degree of certainty matters everywhere in logical reasoning and in reading comprehension. If someone is more certain than the information in the stimulus or the passage warrants, then it's that a claim is unsupported. So if something happens at least sometimes, you cannot then infer it happens the majority of the time. And so when you're reviewing questions you get wrong that have a shift in the degree of certainty, if there was a significant shift and you didn't catch it, that's something to look at more carefully upon your review. So what little thing in the conclusion was going too far? How were they overly certain in their probability? And so I'm thinking of one question. It's from an older exam in the 30s with this girl, Ashley, who I think she collects tanzanite. So if you just Google Ashley tanzanite, you'll find the question. And it talks about how in the stimulus, we're saying probably, like majority likelihood. Then at least one of the or two of the wrong answer choices say always or every single time. Probably is majority, meaning more than half. So above 50% of the time. We cannot then conclude that something is happening all the time or 100% of the time or every time. So that shift makes an answer choice involving every in degree of certainty. It's out, we can eliminate it. Now, this particular question, again, it's about Ashley and the tanzanite stones. That's a parallel reasoning question. That mismatch in degree of certainty still knocks it out. I saw that, Kasha, you were asking about flaw questions. It doesn't matter, though. Any logical reasoning question that contains an argument, if there's a shift in degree of certainty that is meaningful, then you can knock it out. Now, when I say meaningful, what do I mean? I mean that it's a change in the exact scope. So probably to always, no good. Probably to the majority of the time, totally fine, because that's the same level in degree of certainty, even though they're using synonyms. If we go from probably to sometimes, that's kind of a downgrade in degree of certainty. So based on saying this happens probably or the majority of the time, sometimes is less certain than that. It's a smaller claim. It would not be parallel, but it would still be supported by it. So probably supports sometimes, because sometimes is less. Sometimes does not support probably because probably is more. It's a larger claim. So Alyssa, as for your question on absolute versus relative comparisons, I was talking there about things like numbers and percentages. So it's a little bit different. Numbers and percentages are not as common, but it does come up sometimes. So my point there was really, with that example, it's just basically a tough concept in general. But then aside from that, if we have a large percentage of a small group, a large percentage still ends up being a small number. Like 6 out of 10, that's 60%, but 6 people is not a large number of people relative to the population of the United States. Kasha, does that address your question on certainty? Cool. Okay, so back to logical reasoning, and then Grace will circle back to your questions on reviewing games. So we talked a bit about stimulus, question stem, answer choices in logical reasoning. That's conceptual. Then there's practical application in terms of doing timed sections, doing full-length exams. So I want you to focus on pacing and endurance. Endurance is less important on the flex because it's only 3 sections, not 5. For those of you who are keeping up to date in the LSAT world, LSAT just announced that the January and February and April LSATs will all be LSAT flex. So I imagine probably most of you here right now speaking in October will be taking the LSAT in one of those dates. So you've got the flex January, February, April, and those are all going to occur on approximately the same dates as the originally scheduled LSAT. So that means endurance doesn't matter as much. You're doing 3 sections back to back, not 5, but still doing 3 sections with no break is a lot tougher than doing 1 section or even doing just drill sets or untimed problems. So endurance is important. Pacing is even more important. Specifically, you want to be ready to go the second the exam starts. Now, when you're reviewing, you want to think about not only just the accuracy of questions in general, but when you're doing an individual timed section, let's say, where are you misallocating time? You want to be more deliberate in your process to see, are you getting bogged down on the easy questions? That's a common pitfall. Being a perfectionist, trying to get every single point, double checking and triple checking, but logical reasoning in particular is in a general order of difficulty, meaning that the earlier questions are typically going to be easier on average. So you don't want to spend 5 minutes on question number 3 and then never get to the questions later in the section that really deserve that time. On the other hand, you may get bogged down on tough questions more than is worth it. A lot of folks will get stuck on parallel reasoning questions or questions with very abstract language. Those, of course, probably deserve more time than the easier ones, but only up to a point. If you're spending 5 minutes on one problem, when you have an average of 1.5 minutes approximately on each LR question, it's worth spending maybe 2.5 minutes on a parallel, but 5 minutes might be a bit too much unless you've already completed the section and you've secured all those other points. So upon your review, you want to notice, where are you spending too much time? That's part of why it's valuable to review questions not too long after you complete them. You could do them later that day or the following day, but I wouldn't wait 2 weeks because then you're not as likely to remember what your thought process was in the moment, both conceptually and then in terms of the test taking strategy and pacing. So for logical reasoning, as a drill, you may want to think about, in your analysis of the stimulus, breaking down the different pieces of the argument, evidence, sub-conclusion, main conclusion, and so on. For reading comprehension, you could do both individual paragraph summaries as well as just a summary of the passage as a whole. When you're approaching reading comp, can you articulate the main idea, the author's opinion, various viewpoints in the passage, looking at it structurally, not simply paragraph by paragraph, but also thinking, what are the major takeaways? And see, do you find more value in the paragraph summaries or in the more structural analysis of the passage, extracting those big takeaways? Games, of course, is going to be a little bit different because it's much more, in a way, mathematical. It's much more about the diagramming. But that being said, there still is a step-by-step structured approach you want to take. I'll share with you a little bit of my approach. First thing is I read the initial paragraph. So that's kind of like my stimulus for the game. As I read it, I ask myself, what is the task they're asking me to perform? Is it putting things in order? Is it grouping things? Is it involving elements of both? You may see, for example, a game with 7 variables, we're choosing 5. So Those 5 that we choose, we're then putting them in order. So we're choosing 5 out of 7. 2 are going to be out. Then those remaining 5, we put them in order 1 through 5, let's say. That's combination, or one example of combination. Or I might look to see, is this a weird game? Is it a curveball game of some kind? Or does it just seem weird? Now, if it seems weird, regardless, I'm going to have a moment of panic. I'll feel it, my heart in my chest. I'll get a little bit sweaty. I'll get nervous. I'll be like, man, I can't afford to lose points on games, because games I need to get close to perfect, so I lose points on the other sections. So I panic. And then slow down and say, okay, well, is it actually a weird curveball game or not? But experiencing those moments of panic before test day is really important. So the first time you experience it is not on test day itself. So you need to put yourself in those situations where you're going to have that panic. You can have that by doing timed sections. You could have it by doing full-length exams. You can have it by going to study groups. You can have it by talking in class. You could have it by even typing your answer in the chat during our workshops. If you're the first one to put your answer in the chat, you put C, and you're like, I don't know if it's C. I haven't seen 10 other people say C first, so I don't know if it's safe to put it down. It's worth taking that leap of faith. If you get it wrong, no big deal. Nobody's really looking that closely. They're all focused more on what they're answering. The stakes are lower when you do it by yourself in the privacy of your own home with nobody else around. And that's nice. You want to have those moments of safety on in this, but it's also important to take some risks, because test day, of course, is going to be the biggest risk of all when it actually counts. And you've got to have those moments first. I remember hearing the story of somebody who was nervous about public speaking. He was going to give a TED talk, and he knew his heart would be racing. And so practicing in the safety of his own home with nobody else around, it wasn't the same. So he would do like 10 push-ups before practicing the speech to have that heart racing feeling. Obviously, it's in a way, it's fabricated. It's not real, but even so, the physiology of it is still real regardless. So as Alyssa is saying, address your adrenaline beforehand, get used to doing problems with the adrenaline going in general, because on test day, the second it starts, you're going to feel adrenaline. And maybe you feel more when it's going to a testing center in person pre-COVID, but you wouldn't necessarily think it, but it could still be just as nerve-wracking to do things digitally or online as well. I mean, I get nervous teaching classes like this right now, and I have to force myself to slow down and speak more slowly. I don't always succeed at it, but I try. And doing things online over Zoom or over video, I mean, Proctor, you're still online. There's still a camera on you. And so there is, and it's even weird because you can't even see the proctor. So that is kind of strange. That could add a little bit of nerves into it. They're looking at probably 20 people at once. So they're not focused exclusively on you, but you don't really know. So it's kind of like that panopticon sort of feeling. It's worth doing something to simulate the nerves you may feel in that moment. Regardless, use LawHub to do exams in that flex format to at least get some of the simulation down, but you want to simulate the nerves as much as possible. I also noticed that when I do coaching sessions with students, they'll get nervous sometimes, and they might get things wrong more often than they would on a live call than at home by themselves. That's normal. It totally happens. And it's actually good to experience that because, again, you don't want it to be the first time on test day that you have those nerves. Alyssa had mentioned in her presentation the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Fantastic book. I've used it as well, actually, and it really helps you focus on where stress is locked up in the body and can encourage you to really think about and identify and articulate what's going on and why, but not even so much the why as simply the what, because this is not really a rational sort of thing. It ties back to that fight or flight response from our evolution, but regardless, it happens, it's real, and it's almost certainly going to happen on test day in one form or another. So again, it's The Body Keeps the Score. I'll just put that in the chat. So again, back to games. It's about having that moment of panic where you're not really sure what game type is this? Is it a weird game type? Good news is that it doesn't really matter what the game type is. Ordering, grouping, combination, curveball. Obviously, it's nicer if it's ordering because ordering is typically the easiest for most folks. But LSAT is never asking you what game type is this. And in reality, games are not always in neatly defined categories. Whether it's a weird curveball game or not, just know that it's still susceptible to the same strategies regardless. And it's worth taking a moment to at least think, what is the task they're asking you for? Now, when you read the stimulus, I might read that initial paragraph, by the way, multiple times. I don't necessarily read things only once. Same goes for reading comp. I'll read or skim things multiple times to build my layers of understanding. Some folks may find that inefficient because you're looking at the same text multiple times, but regardless, for me, that's what works. And so I do it. You've got to practice and see different strategies that work for you in the end. Maybe reading multiple times is good. Maybe it's not. For me, that's what I do. And I'll look to see first, what's the task? What's the game type? Secondly, I'll see, okay, well, does this lend itself to 7 slots in a row or a T chart with in and out? I'll then also look to see, are there any important rules buried in that initial paragraph? Obviously, most rules are going to be indented. You could even imagine the bullet points there. You could even, at least on the paper, you could have drawn them in. But there are those indented rules, but the initial paragraph can contain them also. If there are in the initial paragraph, I will extract them. Then, of course, I will diagram the indented rules as well, and I'll make sure I diagrammed them correctly. You may misdiagram. You may find that the conditional indicator was buried in the middle of the sentence rather than the beginning. So, for example, A is in slot 1 if B is in slot 2 would be B2 arrow A1. The if in the middle changes everything. Very easy to miss. The famous CD's game featured in Legally Blonde has a bunch of conditional rules, but the first one's actually not a conditional. It's used pop is in, period, new opera is out, period. Not a conditional. The other rules were, though, easy to miss. And so double checking is really important. If you find that you're forgetting rules throughout the game, look back at your diagram. Don't look back at the initial articulation LSAT wrote in text, which will take you longer. It will also serve you well to commit the rules to your short-term working memory. And so that allows you to save time later. So as a drill, you could simply cover up the rules, rewrite them from memory, and test yourself to build that habit of really getting the rules down. Obviously, on test day, you're not going to drill yourself, but you want to be able to extract typically 4 or 5 rules and make sure you've got them down so you can apply them mentally over the course of the game. This is worth doing, especially if upon your review, you discover that you are misdiagramming or misremembering the rules. And this is the sort of thing where these drills you discover by finding what you have trouble with initially. This is not simply about, again, doing random games out of a book. Contrast these two methods. One is really focusing on a specific task and skill set you can apply to time conditions. The other is basically doing whatever the publisher laid out next in the book. Very different in terms of deliberation. I see a lot of folks ask about rule substitution questions. We did a class on those a few weeks back. I'm putting that link in the chat. Big takeaway there for reviewing rule sub questions is do just the question associated with that game for rule sub specifically. So setup, rule sub, setup, rule sub, drill that in particular is the big takeaway there. That's the best way to get better at it. They started with exam 57, have appeared on nearly every exam since. With order of approach in the questions, I recommend orientation question, then local question, then global question. So if you find that your default approach in solving games is to simply do the questions in the order given, I'm not going to tell you to change it. It may work well for you. There is a cost to jumping around, but what you lose is the benefit of potential previous work you could have gained from the local questions. So play with your order upon your review and see what ends up getting you the highest accuracy and also what feels the best. I'm just scrolling up to the previous questions there. So back, Grace, as for your question, if you got certain questions wrong and you want to understand those questions better, I would think about when you look at the explanations, what am I doing? Or if you're using other folks' explanations, what are they doing? For me, I'm typically using previous work a lot, and I'm using my initial inferences a lot as well. And so you'll find that for me, I'll often encounter a global question in the middle of the game. I'll skip it, save it for last, and come back to it later, because then I can benefit from the previous work I'd already done. So That's how I get better and more efficient, by using those hypotheticals. So if you're not benefiting from hypotheticals, or you didn't make as many inferences up front, that's what I would change. Let me know if you still have follow-ups on that one. And then I see Kasha was asking about the answer choices and how to analyze the answer choices, or how to approach them, A through E. I just do A through E. I do them alphabetically. Some folks like to start at E and work back up to A. I find for me that the cost there in terms of doing things in order is too high. It's too high for me to go out of order. So I like just doing things in order within a question, going through the choices. And some folks will analyze and find that D and E are more often correct than A is. And that's true. That meets my analysis as well. And there, you could really go down rabbit holes with answer choices. I don't really bother to that extent, but try it. If you find that you have a time buffer and you find that you do better starting with E, then by all means do that. I'm not going to tell you to change that. Shanaz is writing that she spends too much time making inferences and goes over. And now she has taken the opposite approach and doesn't make enough inferences. Yeah, I mean, that's experimentation to find the sweet spot. You'll see in my explanations, I do a lot of upfront work. I wouldn't necessarily do all that on test day itself. So I don't want to give you the false impression that you need to do all that. I just do it to show you that it can be done and how much it benefits you to have more inferences up front or more multiple main diagrams. The key is to do it methodically and systematically rather than drawing random hypotheticals. And so if I'll see that if a game, I can go down 3 major roads at the outset, I'll go down each of those roads as far as I can. But if there's a conditional rule, I'm not just going to draw out what the conditional leads me to if I don't also have the other scenario. So let's say, for example, if there's a rule saying if X is on 1, then Y is on 2, I could activate that and say, okay, well, when X is on 1, here's what happens. But what about when X is not on 1? If X not on 1 gives me nothing, I wouldn't draw out either one at the outset because I can't see all possible worlds clearly from there. So food for thought. Look at my explanations if you want to see how I break them down and make the inferences, but it's about being methodical. That's how you don't waste time. If you can be methodical about it, then no time is wasted. But if you're just kind of spinning your wheels and feeling like you should do more, but you're not doing really anything useful, then of course, don't do it. Not every game will have a ton of upfront work to be done. It's a question of just where, if you see it, then do it. If you don't see it, don't do it. And then of course, know that you can also do more work over the course of the game with your local if questions. Those will carry you somewhere, giving you more to work with. And every diagram you draw teaches you something new. So on your review, think about, even for the local questions, did you not draw as much as you could have? Because the local if gives you new information to apply, then the question is asking you to take it as far as you can. And typically the correct answer is what you could have derived from that. So if you don't take it far enough, you're not going to get enough out of it. So the key is to, of course, recognize how the different rules interact, which is why it's so important to have those rules baked into your memory, or at least to be able to quickly look at your diagrams when you can.
I think in trying to save time, I've tried to cut out the upfront work, which actually worked really badly. Because then when I was going through the games, especially since I haven't been doing local and then global, I've kind of just been going straight through. I've run into a lot of issues where I have to go back to the game and then making more inferences when I could have just done it all up front. So I feel like I'm kind of struggling to balance those two right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the key is going to be to do either upfront inferences or more hypotheticals. But if you do neither, that's where you run into trouble, because the games are testing your ability to make inferences of some type. You can make them up front, like I like to do, or you could make them over the course of the game with the hypotheticals, which I'll do sometimes. But if you do neither, then you're not really making the connections they're testing your ability to make. So you got to do at least one of the two. So I'd suggest in your case, if you're finding that upfront work isn't clicking, that style isn't working for you and you're not getting far enough, then I would suggest in your case, trying to do the local if questions first, make the hypotheticals, carry it as far as you can there. So at least you have the benefit of those hypotheticals to solve the global must be trues. But the global must be truths are going to require that you have at least something to work with up to that point. Nikki, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, hey, I just had a really quick question for you. So, in terms of the logic games, I can definitely see the benefit in doing the question type. So I think it was global first and then local. And I can see why that would have been a little more straightforward on the paper LSAT, because you can see all the questions, you can kind of just quickly put a number down. In terms of the digital, I'm still doing it just kind of as they come up. I want to try to do it by question type. But in order to do that, how do you recommend approaching it? Like, do you just kind of really quickly go through the questions, maybe write it down on a piece of paper, the order that you want to do them in, like on your scrap piece of paper, and then go back to the questions and actually do them? Or?
Yeah, good question. It's a little bit different doing it online with the Flex, of course. You can click left and right. I would just click left and right. And then, of course, they do at least segment different games. So they'll have like, at the bottom, there's a little navigation bar at a glance showing you what you've done, what you haven't. So let's say 1 through 5 is game 1, 6 through 11 is game 2, and there's a line between the 5 and 6. So in that case, I'd say click left and right and jump around as you need to. On your scratch paper, if you draw local hypotheticals, you could label them like, here's my diagram for number 2, or here's my correct answer to number 1, the orientation question. Here's what that scenario was. So that scenario was variables 1 through 7 were ordered A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You have that orientation scenario down. Then you know for number 2, you drew this other scenario. You're skipping 3, no diagram for 3, go on to 4, then you come back. And by the way, the order for those curious was orientation, which is the general question asking which one of the following is a valid scenario. That's kind of your quote unquote gimme or warm up question. Then you have your local if questions. Then you have your global general, what must be true, what cannot be true, and so on. So again, the local is the if, like if X is on 3, what else happens? Versus the global, which doesn't really give you any if to work with. So it's far more open-ended, which is why I would save those for last. Then you have the benefit of the hypotheticals up to that point. All right, folks. Well, this has been a fantastic class. Thank you for all your great questions and engagement. We have the group coaching mastermind coming up in just a minute. Link is in your email from about an hour ago. So I hope to see you all there. Bye all.